For 70 years, Turkey was America's ally, a NATO member, a secular democracy, a bridge between the Islamic world and the West, the nation that guarded the southern flank of the Atlantic Alliance against the Soviet Union, the nation whose military bases hosted American nuclear weapons, the nation that sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia and chose, deliberately, repeatedly, the Western side. And then something changed. Slowly, then suddenly, like every great geopolitical transformation in history, Turkey began purchasing Russian missile defense systems in direct violation of NATO agreements. Turkey began building relationships with Iran, with Hamas, with the Muslim Brotherhood, with every Islamist movement that the Western Alliance had spent decades trying to contain. Turkey began positioning itself not as a bridge between civilizations, but as the leader of one. And the Bible, written 2,600 years ago, saw it coming. But what no one knew was that Turkey is not simply a geopolitical actor that happens to match a biblical prophecy. Turkey, ancient Anatolia, the land of Gomer and Beth Togarmah, occupies more prophetic real estate than almost any other nation on earth. The 7 churches of Revelation were on Turkish soil. The early church councils met in Turkey. Paul planted his most significant churches in Turkey, and Ezekiel named Turkey in the coalition that will march against Israel in the last days. The warning has been in the text for 2,600 years. The events are unfolding right now, and the time to understand what the Bible says about Turkey is before it is too late. Welcome to Journey Bible Stories. Subscribe right now. This is Turkey in the Bible, the 3rd coalition member, the nation nobody warned you about. Until now, let's begin. Before we examine Turkey's role in end times prophecy, we need to establish something that most Christians have never considered. Turkey, modern Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, sits on the most biblically significant piece of real estate on earth outside of Israel itself. The Apostle Paul was born in Tarsus, modern Turkey. His first missionary journey was entirely within what is now Turkey, the regions of Galatia, Pisidia, Pamphylia, Lycia. His second and third missionary journeys were largely centered on Turkish territory. Ephesus, Corinth was reached through Turkey, Colossae, Laodicea, Philadelphia, Pergamum, Sardis, Smyrna, Thyatira. The 7 churches of Revelation, the 7 letters that open the book and describe the spiritual condition of the church in its final age, are all located in Turkey. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, all Turkish cities, all on Turkish soil. The first 3 great ecumenical councils of the Church, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, were held in Turkey. The Nicene Creed, the foundational theological statement of Christian orthodoxy, was formulated on Turkish soil. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the heartland of the Church was Turkey. Asia Minor was Christian before Europe was Christian, before Africa was Christian, before America existed. But what no one knew was the devastating irony of what Turkey became. The land that was once the heartland of world Christianity, that produced Paul, that hosted the 7 churches, that formulated the creeds, is today a nation where Christians constitute less than 0.2% of the population. A nation where ancient churches have been converted to mosques, where Christian communities that survived for 2,000 years have been reduced to near extinction. The spiritual trajectory of Turkey from the heartland of Christianity to a nation considering leadership of the Islamic world is itself a prophetic statement. And it is embedded in the letters to the 7 churches of Revelation in ways that the Church has not adequately heard. Genesis 10:2-3, the table of nations, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Gomer, the firstborn of Japheth, his descendants, The Gomerites are identified by ancient historians with the Cimmerians, a fierce nomadic warrior people who invaded Asia Minor, modern Turkey, in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, terrorizing the civilizations of the ancient Near East. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus writes about the Cimmerians. The Assyrian records of Sargon II and Esarhaddon describe military campaigns against the Gimri, the Assyrian name for the Cimmerians. The Ugaritic texts mention them. They are not a legendary people. They are a historically documented ancient nation whose territory was centered on the region of modern Turkey. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, whose identification of Genesis' 10 peoples has been consistently reliable, connects the Gomerites to the Galatians of Asia Minor. Galatia, the region Paul evangelized on his first missionary journey. The region to which he wrote the letter to the Galatians was the territory of ancient Gomer. But what no one knew was the specific detail in Ezekiel 38:6 that connects Gomer directly to the End Times coalition. Ezekiel 38:6, Gomer and all his hordes, Beth Togarmah from the uttermost parts of the north with all his hordes, many peoples are with you. Gomer, and all his hordes. Turkey, ancient Gomer, is named explicitly in the coalition. With all his hordes, a phrase suggesting a large military contribution, not a minor member, a significant participant. And immediately after Gomer, Beth Togarmah, another Turkish identification, 2 separate Ezekiel 38 coalition members, both pointing to the territory of modern Turkey. The Bible names Turkey twice in the coalition that invades Israel, twice, Genesis 10:3, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Rephath, and Togarmah. Togarmah, the grandson of Japheth through Gomer, Beth Togarmah, the house of Togarmah, appears in Ezekiel 27:14 as a trading partner of ancient Tyre. Beth Togarmah exchanged for your wares horses, war horses, and mules. Horses and war horses, a military power of the ancient world known for its cavalry. Located in the north, Ezekiel 38:6 says Beth Togarmah comes from the uttermost parts of the north. The identification of Togarmah is one of the most consistent in all ancient sources. Armenian tradition, preserved for centuries, identified their ancestors as the descendants of Togarmah. The Armenian name for their own people is Hayastan, and their ancient traditions trace their lineage to Togarmah, son of Gomer, grandson of Japheth. The territory of ancient Togarmah corresponds to eastern Turkey and the Armenian highlands, the region around modern eastern Turkey, Armenia, and the Caucasus. The same geographical area that is today contested between Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, a region of ongoing geopolitical conflict. But what no one knew was the specific phrase used for Beth Togarmah in Ezekiel 38:6, from the uttermost parts of the north, the same directional designation used for Gog himself, the extreme northern position. Beth Togarmah comes from the far north of Israel. Turkey sits to the north of Israel. The mountainous eastern region of Turkey, ancient Beth Togarmah, sits further north still. The geographical description is precise. 2 names, 2 geographical designations, both pointing to modern Turkey, both named in the coalition that Ezekiel 38 says will march against Israel in the last days. The Bible has been naming Turkey for 2,600 years. The only question is whether we will listen before the march begins. Revelation 2-3, the 7 letters, written to 7 churches on Turkish soil, and what Jesus says to these churches, in some cases, sounds less like pastoral encouragement and more like a prophetic warning about the spiritual trajectory of the land they inhabit. Pergamum, Revelation 2:12-17. Jesus says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Pergamum, the location of Satan's throne. The ancient city contained the great altar of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. a city where emperor worship was enforced, where Christians were martyred for refusing to call Caesar Lord. And Jesus says, "You dwell where Satan's throne is," not was, is, present tense. The spiritual geography of ancient Pergamum was defined by the location of satanic authority. Today, Pergamum is the Turkish city of Bergama. The altar of Zeus was taken to Berlin in the 19th century, where it sits in the Pergamon Museum, but the territory remains. Thyatira, Revelation 2:18-29, a church that tolerated Jezebel, a false prophetess teaching sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. The spirit of Jezebel in the Turkish church. Sardis, Revelation 3:16. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. A church that appeared to be functioning, but was spiritually lifeless. Laodicea, Revelation 3:14-22, neither hot nor cold, lukewarm, rich but spiritually destitute. But what no one knew was the cumulative prophetic weight of these letters for the land that received them. 5 of the 7 churches received warnings or rebukes, ranging from tolerance of false teaching to spiritual death to complete lukewarmness. Only Smyrna and Philadelphia received unqualified commendation. The land of Turkey was warned by the risen Christ himself about its spiritual direction. The warnings were not heeded, the churches declined. The land was taken by Islam, and the nation that was once the heartland of Christianity is now positioning itself as the leader of the Islamic world. The 7 letters were not just pastoral correspondence. They were prophetic warnings to a land that would eventually fulfill them in reverse. From church to mosque, from Christianity to Islam, from the kingdom of God to the throne of Satan. To understand Turkey's prophetic position, we need to understand its imperial history, because the Ottoman Empire, the last great Islamic caliphate, was one of the most significant geopolitical entities of the past 6 centuries. And its collapse in 1924 created a wound in the Islamic world that has not healed, and whose healing is one of the explicit goals of modern Turkish political leadership. The Ottoman Empire at its peak controlled territory stretching from Morocco to Iran, from Hungary to the Arabian Peninsula. It conquered Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian world, in 1453. A date that marked the end of the Christian Roman Empire and the beginning of the Ottoman domination of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. For 400 years, the Ottoman Empire controlled the land of Israel. Jerusalem was an Ottoman city from 1517 to 1917, when British General Allenby entered the city and ended Ottoman rule. The Balfour Declaration, issued the same year, began the process of restoring a Jewish homeland. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved and replaced by the secular Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923-1924. The Caliphate, the office of the supreme leader of the Islamic world held by the Ottoman Sultan, was formally abolished in 1924. For the first time in 13 centuries, there was no caliph, but what no one knew was how deeply that abolition wounded the Islamic world's sense of identity and purpose. The loss of the caliphate has been described by Islamic scholars as one of the most traumatic events in Islamic history, and the desire to restore it, to re-establish the caliphate, has been a driving force in Islamic political thought, from the Muslim Brotherhood to ISIS to the Turkish AKP party. Erdogan's Turkey has been systematically positioning itself to lead the Islamic world, to be, in effect, the successor to the Ottoman Caliphate. The reconversion of the Hagia Sophia from a museum to a mosque in 2020, the most powerful symbolic act in Turkish political history, was an explicit statement. The Ottoman era is not history, it is aspiration. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been the dominant political figure in Turkey since 2003. and his vision for Turkey's future, articulated consistently across 2 decades of political leadership, is not subtle, it is not hidden, it is stated openly, and it maps onto the Ezekiel 38 coalition with a precision that demands prophetic attention. Erdogan's vision, variously called Neo-Ottomanism, the New Turkey, or strategic depth, sees Turkey as the natural leader of the Islamic world, not simply a regional power in NATO's southern flank, but the center of a revived Islamic civilization. Under Erdogan, Turkey has systematically expanded its military presence across the Muslim world. Turkish military bases in Somalia, Qatar, Libya, and Azerbaijan. Military involvement in Syria, Iraq, and the Caucasus. Arms sales to Islamic nations. Diplomatic leadership in Palestinian causes. Turkey under Erdogan has been the most consistent international supporter of Hamas, the Palestinian terrorist organization that controls Gaza. After Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack on Israel, the deadliest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust, Erdogan praised Hamas as a resistance organization and hosted its leaders in Ankara. But what no one knew was the specific theological framework Erdogan has used to justify Turkey's regional ambitions. In multiple speeches, he has described Turkey's mission in explicitly Islamic terms, referencing the Ottoman legacy, the responsibility of Turkish leadership to the Islamic world, the divine mandate of Turkish civilization, a leader who frames his nation's geopolitical ambitions in theological terms, who sees his nation as the center of an Islamic civilization that must reassert itself against the West and against Israel, who has systematically built the relationships with Russia, with Iran, that constitute the Ezekiel 38 coalition. Ezekiel saw a coalition. Erdogan is building it. The prophet and the politician are describing the same reality from different sides of 2,600 years of history. For 70 years, Turkey was the anchor of NATO's eastern flank. The agreement was simple. Turkey provided strategic geography, controlling the Bosphorus, the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the choke point through which Russian naval power must pass to reach the open ocean. And in return, America and Europe provided security guarantees and economic partnership. It was one of the most important strategic relationships of the Cold War. And it is ending. Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system in 2019, in direct violation of NATO agreements about interoperability, was the clearest signal. You do not buy the air defense system of your alliance's primary enemy unless you are reconsidering your alliance. Turkey was subsequently expelled from the F-35 fighter jet program. Relations with Washington deteriorated sharply. Erdogan publicly questioned Turkey's future in NATO on multiple occasions. Turkey has used its NATO membership as leverage, blocking Sweden's and Finland's accession to NATO for over a year, extracting political concessions before allowing membership. Not the behavior of a committed alliance partner. The behavior of a nation that views its NATO membership as a bargaining chip rather than a strategic commitment. But what no one knew was the specific prophetic implication of Turkey's departure from the Western alliance. Ezekiel 38 describes Gomer and Beth Togarmah as members of the Russian-led coalition against Israel, not members of the Western alliance, coalition members on the other side. For Turkey to fulfill its Ezekiel 38 role, it must leave the Western alliance. It must reorient toward Russia and Iran. It must become the Islamic power leading a coalition rather than the secular democracy bridging civilizations. That transition is not a future prophecy awaiting fulfillment. It is a present reality unfolding in real time. The Turkey of Ezekiel 38 is not a future Turkey that somehow transforms from a Western ally into a Russian coalition member. It is the Turkey of today, right now. in the headlines every week. On July 24, 2020, Recep Tayyip Erdogan led Friday prayers inside the Hagia Sophia. For the first time in 86 years, the most famous building in Turkey, for 900 years, the greatest Christian cathedral in the world, for 500 years the greatest mosque in the Islamic world, was officially reconverted to a mosque. The Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom in Greek, was built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in 537 AD. For 900 years, it was the seat of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the building where Byzantine emperors were crowned, and where the liturgical life of the Eastern Church found its highest expression. On May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II rode his horse through its doors after the fall of Constantinople. He declared it a mosque. The mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary were plastered over. The church that had stood for 900 years was transformed in a single day. In 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk converted it to a museum, a symbol of Turkey's secular modernizing vision. Neither Christian nor Muslim, a monument to history. And in 2020, Erdogan reversed Ataturk, converted it back to a mosque, led the first prayers himself, standing in the building that for centuries had been the symbolic heart of world Christianity, now reclaimed for Islam. But what no one knew was the specific theological statement this made to the Islamic world. The reconversion of the Hagia Sophia was not an architectural decision. It was a declaration, a statement about who owns the future of the land that was once the heartland of Christianity, about who speaks for the civilization that will emerge from Turkey's territory. Revelation 2:13, Pergamum, where Satan's throne is. The spiritual geography that the risen Christ identified in first-century Turkey has not changed. It has simply found new expression. The building that once proclaimed holy wisdom now proclaims a different Lord. And the man who leads the prayers inside it is positioning his nation for the role that Ezekiel 38 assigned to Gomer and Beth Togarmah. There is a diplomatic framework that most Western news consumers have never heard of. It is called the Astana process, and it is one of the most prophetically significant geopolitical developments of the 21st century. In January 2017, Russia, Turkey, and Iran met in Astana, Kazakhstan, to negotiate a framework for ending the Syrian civil war. The three nations, with competing interests in Syria, with very different ideological orientations, with a history of mutual suspicion, found enough common ground to establish a joint diplomatic mechanism, and they have been meeting regularly ever since. Russia, Magog, the far north power of Ezekiel 38, Iran, Persia, the explicitly named coalition member, Turkey, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah, the third member, three of the five primary nations of the Ezekiel 38 coalition, meeting regularly, coordinating strategy, building institutional relationships, in a process that began in 2017 and has continued through multiple rounds of negotiations. The Astana process has given Russia, Turkey, and Iran a shared institutional framework. Regular diplomatic meetings, military coordination, intelligence sharing in Syria, a working relationship that has grown more sophisticated with every meeting. But what no one knew was what the Astana process represents from a prophetic perspective. Ezekiel 38 does not simply describe nations that happen to attack Israel simultaneously. It describes a coordinated coalition. Gog leads. The named nations follow. They march together as a single military force. Coalitions do not form overnight. They require relationships, trust, institutional mechanisms, communication channels, shared interests established over time through cooperation. The Astana process is building exactly those foundations. Russia, Turkey, and Iran, three nations with historical reasons to distrust each other, are developing the institutional relationships and the pattern of cooperation that a military coalition requires. Ezekiel described the coalition. The Astana process is building it. The prophet is ahead of the diplomat by 2,600 years. but the diplomat is catching up. Daniel 8, the vision of the ram and the he-goat, two of the most precisely fulfilled prophecies in the entire Old Testament, and a passage that has direct relevance to the Turkish territory in the end-time scenario. Daniel 8:20-21 provides the interpretation directly. The ram with two horns, the kings of Media and Persia, the he-goat from the west, the king of Greece, whose large horn is the first king. Historically fulfilled with extraordinary precision, Alexander the Great of Macedonia destroyed the Persian Empire in a lightning military campaign from 334 to 323 BC. The large horn, Alexander, was broken at the height of his power. 4 horns rose in its place. The 4 kingdoms his empire was divided into after his death. Turkey was part of that Greek successor kingdom. The Seleucid Empire controlled much of Asia Minor, and the Attalid kingdom of Pergamum was another successor state in Turkish territory. But Daniel 8:23-25 describes a little horn arising from one of those 4 kingdoms, a figure of particular evil who desecrates the sanctuary and opposes the Prince of Princes. Most scholars see the near fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who desecrated the Jerusalem temple in 167 BC and became the template for the Antichrist figure. But what no one knew was the geographical connection this creates between the Antichrist typology and the Turkish territory. If Antiochus Epiphanes, the prototype of the Antichrist, ruled from the Seleucid territory that included modern Turkey and Syria, then the Antichrist's geographical origin, or base of operations, may be connected to the same region. The 7 churches are warned about spiritual corruption in Turkey. The Seleucid prototype of the Antichrist ruled from Turkish territory. Ezekiel names Turkey in the End Times coalition. The pattern of prophetic attention to Turkish geography is too consistent to be accidental. Among the 7 letters to the churches of Turkey, one stands apart. One receives no rebuke. One is given the most extraordinary promise in all 7 letters. And that church is Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Revelation 3:7-13. The letter to Philadelphia. Jesus says, "I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." Little power, but faithful. The church with little power, not the impressive church, not the numerically large church, not the culturally dominant church, but the faithful one. The one that kept his word and did not deny his name. And the promise. Revelation 3:10-11, "Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world." The hour of trial, widely understood as the tribulation period, the promise of preservation through the most intense period of judgment the world will ever experience. But what no one knew was the specific application to Turkey. Philadelphia, modern Alaşehir in Turkey, had a small, faithful Christian community that persisted through the Ottoman conquest, through centuries of Islamic pressure into the modern era. A tiny remnant of Turkish Christianity that maintained its witness against overwhelming odds. The Philadelphia promise applies to the faithful remnant inside Turkey and to faithful believers everywhere who hold fast in the hour when the nations are making their terrible choices, when the coalition is forming, when the march is beginning. In Turkey, in the land of Gomer and Beth Togarmah, there is a Philadelphia. There are faithful ones. Hold fast. The one who keeps you from the hour of trial is coming soon. The Bosphorus Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and from there to the Mediterranean, is controlled by Turkey. It is approximately 30 kilometers long and less than a kilometer wide at its narrowest point, and it is the most strategically significant body of water in the world. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, including its naval assets in Crimea and Sevastopol, can only reach the Mediterranean and the open ocean by passing through the Bosphorus. Turkey controls the switch. In 1936, the Montreux Convention gave Turkey sovereign control over the strait, with specific rules about naval transit in times of war. Under these rules, Turkey can close the Bosphorus to the warships of belligerent nations during wartime. In 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention and closed the Bosphorus to additional warships from all belligerent nations, effectively preventing Russia from reinforcing its Black Sea Fleet and preventing NATO nations from sending additional warships into the Black Sea. But what no one knew was the prophetic implication of Turkish control over this strait in the context of the Ezekiel 38 scenario. If the Gog-Magog coalition involves a combined Russian, Turkish-Iranian military operation, Turkey's control of the Bosphorus becomes not an obstacle to Russian power, but an asset, a Turkish ally, rather than a NATO member. Holding the key to the Black Sea dramatically simplifies Russian naval strategy in the eastern Mediterranean. The geographical position that made Turkey so valuable to NATO is the same position that makes Turkey so valuable to the Ezekiel 38 coalition. The Bosphorus is Turkey's most powerful card, and Turkey is deciding which player to deal it to. For 3 decades, from the 1990s through the late 2000s, Turkey and Israel maintained one of the most significant bilateral relationships in the entire Middle East. Military cooperation, intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, trade, tourism, diplomatic partnership. Turkey was the first Muslim-majority nation to recognize the State of Israel in 1949. For decades, Turkish-Israeli relations were a model of Muslim-Jewish cooperation, proof that the two could coexist, trade, and even form strategic partnerships. And then, under Erdogan, that relationship was systematically dismantled. The 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, a Turkish vessel attempting to break the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza, resulting in the deaths of 9 Turkish activists, triggered a diplomatic rupture that has never been fully repaired. Erdogan used the incident to position Turkey as the defender of Palestinian rights and the opponent of Israeli policy. Over the following years, Erdogan's rhetoric toward Israel became increasingly extreme. He called Israel a terrorist state. He compared Israeli military operations to Nazi atrocities. He hosted Hamas leaders in Ankara. He led prayers for Gaza in mosques across Turkey. After October 7, 2023, Hamas's massacre of over 1,200 Israeli civilians, Turkey was among the most vocal international defenders of Hamas. Erdogan hosted Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Istanbul. He called Hamas resistance fighters, not terrorists. He suspended diplomatic relations with Israel. But what no one knew was the theological trajectory this represents. A nation that was once Israel's closest Muslim ally, that had a genuine, functional, strategic partnership with the Jewish state, has become one of its most vociferous opponents. The change did not happen by accident. It happened through the deliberate choices of a leader with a specific theological and political vision. Ezekiel 38 does not describe Turkey as a neutral bystander or a reluctant coalition member. It describes Gomer with all his hordes, an enthusiastic participant. The transformation of Turkey from Israel's ally to Israel's enemy is not a geopolitical accident. It is prophecy walking in real time. To understand the full prophetic picture of Turkey, we cannot avoid its darkest chapter, the Armenian genocide of 1915-1923. The Armenian people, descendants of ancient Togarma, the biblical ancestor of the Turkish peoples, had been the most significant Christian community in the Ottoman Empire. Armenians had maintained their Christian faith through centuries of Islamic rule, preserving their language, their liturgy, their identity as a covenant people descended from the people of Noah. Between 1915 and 1923, the Ottoman government, the Young Turks regime, systematically murdered approximately 1.5 million Armenians. Men were executed, women and children were marched into the desert to die, churches were destroyed, communities that had existed for 2,000 years were eliminated. The Armenian genocide is recognized by most scholars and many governments as the first genocide of the 20th century. Turkey, to this day, officially denies it. But what no one knew was the prophetic dimension of what was destroyed. The Armenian Church, ancient apostolic Christian since the conversion of King Tiridates III in 301 AD, making Armenia the first Christian nation in history, was systematically destroyed in the Ottoman genocide. The most ancient Christian community in the region of ancient Togarmah, the biblical homeland of Turkey, was eliminated. The descendants of Togarmah murdered the most faithful Christian community in their territory, and then denied they did it. Revelation 6, 9-10. The fifth seal. The souls under the altar, those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne, crying out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, before you judge and avenge our blood?" The blood of the Armenian martyrs cries from the soil of Turkey. The God who hears the blood of Abel crying from the ground hears it. This topic requires the most careful handling of anything we have covered, because the identification of the Antichrist is one of the most speculative areas of prophetic interpretation, and history is full of premature and wrong identifications. We engage with this question not to make a specific claim, but to trace the biblical evidence honestly. The Antichrist, the final world ruler described in Daniel 7, 2 Thessalonians 2, Revelation 13, comes from within the boundaries of the ancient Roman Empire, according to the most widely accepted interpretation of Daniel 9:26. The people of the prince who is to come destroyed the city, Jerusalem, in 70 AD. The people were the Romans. So the prince who is to come, the Antichrist, comes from the Roman sphere. But the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire, its Asian provinces, included all of modern Turkey. Asia Minor was fully Roman. The 7 churches were in Roman Asia. Paul's missionary territory was Roman Asia, and a growing school of prophetic scholarship centered on the work of scholars like Joel Richardson argues that the Antichrist will be Islamic rather than European, and will arise from the territory of the ancient Islamic caliphates, which is largely coterminous with the territory of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Under this Islamic Antichrist interpretation, the seat of the final world empire is not Rome or Brussels or Washington, but somewhere in the Middle Eastern or Central Asian world. Possibly Turkey, possibly the territory that was once the Ottoman Caliphate. But what no one knew was the specific detail in Revelation 13:2 that connects the beast's authority to the dragon, who gives it his power and throne and great authority. And Revelation 2:13 identifies Pergamum in Turkey as the location of Satan's throne. The throne of Satan is in Turkey. The beast receives power from the dragon. The geographical connection is suggestive, not conclusive but not dismissible. In the midst of everything we have described, the coalition forming, the alliance shifting, the prophetic trajectory accelerating, there is a remnant, a small, faithful, persecuted community of believers in Turkey who are holding fast in the most difficult spiritual environment imaginable. Turkey's Christian population is approximately 0.2%, roughly 160,000 people in a nation of 85 million. The majority are Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, and Catholic, ancient communities surviving in diminished form. Protestant and evangelical Christians number perhaps 5,000 to 10,000. These believers live under consistent social pressure, occasional violence, and systematic legal disadvantage. Churches cannot be legally established as new congregations. Christian missionaries face surveillance and harassment. Converts from Islam face social ostracism and sometimes violence from their families. And yet, the church grows, slowly, against every obstacle. In the land of the seven churches, in the land of Paul's missionary journeys, in the land that was once the heartland of world Christianity, a small, growing remnant of believers is holding fast. But what no one knew was the specific significance of Turkish Christian witness in the prophetic framework. Ezekiel 38 describes Gomer and Beth Togarmah as coalition members, nations that march against Israel. But within those nations, within the coalition members themselves, God always has his remnant, his Philadelphia. The same nation that produces the coalition also produces the faithful ones who refuse to bow. The same land that provides troops for the march against Israel also provides witnesses to the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ, who will not deny his name regardless of the cost. In Turkey right now, there are believers living out the Philadelphia promise, holding fast, with little power, keeping his word, not denying his name. The coalition is forming around them. The march may be coming, but the promise is still standing. I will keep you from the hour of trial. We do not need to speculate about Turkey's prophetic trajectory. We only need to read the headlines. Turkey is building the largest military drone program in the world. The Bayraktar TB2 drone, developed in Turkey, battle-tested in Syria, Libya, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine, has become one of the most influential weapon systems of the 21st century. Turkey sells its drones to nations across the Islamic world, to Central Asia, to Africa. It is building military power and military influence simultaneously. Turkey is pursuing membership in the BRICS economic bloc, the alliance of nations specifically positioning themselves outside Western economic dominance. Russia, China, Iran, and now Turkey, the same nations whose prophetic profiles align with the Ezekiel 38 coalition, building an economic architecture that operates independently of the Western-dominated financial system. Turkey is expanding its military presence in Somalia, Qatar, Libya, Niger, and across the African continent. It is projecting military power south and west, building the network of relationships and bases that a regional military power requires. Turkey's rhetorical position on Israel, supporting Hamas, condemning Israeli military operations, calling for international action against Israel, has consistently aligned with the most extreme anti-Israel positions in the Islamic world. But what no one knew was the specific speed of this transformation. 20 years ago, Turkey was a secular democracy, a NATO ally, a strategic partner of Israel, and a candidate for European Union membership. Today, it is building Islamic influence networks, purchasing Russian weapons, hosting Hamas, positioning for BRICS, and systematically dismantling the relationships that defined it as a Western nation. 20 years, that is how long it has taken for Turkey to reorient from west to east, from ally of Israel to enemy, from NATO member to coalition partner of Russia and Iran. Ezekiel 38 did not say how long the coalition would take to form, it said it would form, and it is forming in real time in the headlines right now. We have traveled from Genesis 10 to Revelation 3, from the Table of Nations to the seven churches, from the ancient Sumerians to Erdogan's neo-Ottoman vision, from the founding of Christianity in Turkey to its near extinction there, from the Astana process to the broken Israeli-Turkish alliance, and now the urgent warning that the entire story has been building toward. The coalition is forming, not someday, now. The nations Ezekiel named are aligning, Russia, Iran, Turkey, in institutional relationships, in military cooperation, in shared anti-Israel ideology, for the first time in 2,600 years. The prerequisite has been met. Israel is regathered. The players are in position. The relationships are being built. We do not know when the march will begin. We do not know the day or the hour. Jesus was explicit about that. But we do know the direction of travel. And the direction of travel is toward the moment Ezekiel described. But what no one knew was the most urgent personal application of everything Turkey's story reveals. Turkey was the heartland of Christianity. It received the letters of Paul. It hosted the 7 churches. It formulated the creeds. It was warned by the risen Christ himself about its spiritual trajectory, and it did not heed the warning. The letters to the 7 churches were written to Turkey, but they were preserved for the entire church, for every generation, including ours, including you. Are you Ephesus, having left your first love? Are you Pergamum, tolerating what God calls an abomination? Are you Sardis, appearing alive but spiritually dead? Are you Laodicea, rich, comfortable and lukewarm? Or are you Philadelphia, little power, faithful witness, keeping his word, not denying his name? The coalition that is forming in Turkey is a warning to the church everywhere, not a reason for fear, a reason for urgency, for faithfulness, for the kind of unapologetic, on-fire, Philadelphia spirit Christianity that holds fast regardless of the surrounding pressure. Turkey is showing us what happens when the church loses its salt, when the letters are read but not heeded, when comfort replaces conviction and cultural accommodation replaces courageous witness. Do not be Turkey. Be Philadelphia. Hold fast what you have so that no one may seize your crown. The signs are everywhere. The time is short, and the one who is coming soon. The land of Turkey gave us Paul. It gave us the 7 churches. It gave us the creeds. It gave us the greatest Christian cathedral in history. It gave us 2,000 years of faithful witness by Armenian, Greek, and Syrian Christians who held on through persecution, through conquest, through genocide. And it is now giving us the 3rd coalition member, Gomer with all his hordes, Beth Togarmah from the uttermost parts of the north, marching under the leadership of Gog, in alliance with Persia and Cush and Put, toward the mountains of Israel. The warning has been in the text for 2,600 years. The prophet Ezekiel wrote it by a river in Babylon. The risen Christ wrote it in 7 letters to 7 churches on Turkish soil. And the geopolitical events of our time are writing it in headlines every single week. This is not a time for spiritual indifference. This is not a time for lukewarm Christianity. This is not a time to be Laodicea. This is the hour of Philadelphia, small, without great power, but faithful, keeping his word, not denying his name. Because the one who holds the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open, has set before his faithful people an open door. And no coalition forming in Turkey or Russia or Iran can shut it. The coalition is forming. The door is open. The king is coming. Hold fast. He is coming soon. Subscribe to Journey Bible Stories right now. Every week, the ancient word, the modern world, the urgent hour. Drop one word in the comments. What does Turkey's story stir in you right now? Share this with every believer you know who is watching the headlines and wondering what time it is. Tell them, it is Philadelphia time. Hold fast. He is coming soon. See you in the next one.